Well, this is a bit of a homecoming for me, and I just wanted to say this should be reversed. I wish I had time to spend with each of you to listen on front porches, the accumulated wisdom that each of you have gathered through your lives. I'm going to, the Central Valley Partnership is a regional progressive network of labor unions, environmental groups, and community organizations from Madera to Kern County. And I'm, though, going to speak to you today as a scholar of the San Joaquin Valley, in particular this region that we live in. I've thought about the title of this. Vishnu asked me for the title a few days ago, and I love the title, but I've also thought about the political economy of an agrarian democracy to take it more broadly. But there's no place to talk about democracy and economics and the intersection of the political economy than a place like the San Joaquin Valley, the most productive food-producing region in the history of the world, the wealthiest one, and yet the highest pollution, the highest poverty, the highest hunger in the United States. And what is the reason of that paradox? Geographies are created. This place was created to be productive, but the externalities have come back to haunt us, and they were foretold before. So when I was at Davis, it took 20 years for me to put together what I recently published in 2011 at Cornell University as my dissertation. You can find it. So everything, I'm going to try to talk to you today in 20, 25 minutes, and then Vishnu or somebody just needs to stand up. Politicians and academics are similarly long-winded, so just stand up and say, you're done. The longer version you can get online. It's called In the Struggle, Pedagogies of Politically Engaged Scholarship in the San Joaquin Valley. Just Google In the Struggle, Daniel O'Connell and Cornell, and you'll get the entire 400-page dissertation. Don't be too intimidated. Most of that study is in narrative. So human beings are a social animal. We carry our knowledge best, not in statistics or numbers, but in stories. And so I wanted that dissertation to be communicable in the most easy way. And just 2 weeks ago, I heard from New Village Press that my Cornell counterpart, Scott Peters, and I will be publishing this as a book coming out in summer of 2020, just before the next election. And it will be designed as ammunition to be used by citizens and others in fighting for these causes that we all share. While I was at Davis for my master's and Cornell for my doctoral work, emeritus professors were key to my understanding of the institutions. Orville Thompson was retired and in his office often at Davis, and Vern Rockcastle at Cornell. And I often sat and listened to them, and they gave me invaluable information. And it seems like in our culture, in Western culture, and the culture of the United States, we don't value elders enough. And young people have so much energy. Our culture is prioritizing young people, and to the detriment of our culture. As I was in Africa, I lived with the San, and I lived with African tribes. They value their elders. Indigenous peoples value their elders, and we need to do a better job of that. But a lot of my thinking evolved from talking with retired academics. And when I moved to the Central Valley, Ray Malikian, a World War II fighter pilot and Tulare County farmer, read the dissertation and said every farmer should read this study. So I'm going to start with some fundamental questions, and then I'm going to answer it as far as I know, and then cut you loose to think of that in these coming years for yourselves. But I wanted to frame the discussion today around some questions. So the first is, what economic structure is conducive to build and maintain a democratic society? What economic system would be best for a democratic society? Or, I reframed it a bit, in a functioning democracy, how should that be represented and realized in daily life? If we're living in a democracy, what should our daily life, should we see homelessness like we do? Should we have air pollution like we have? Should we experience racism and gender inequality as we do. Let's reverse that. Let's take the converse. What would feudalism look like in a modern society? What would feudalism look like in a modern society? Is it possible to have democracy in a feudalistic economy and this United States fought a war against slavery, the exact opposite of a market economy? And so we have grappled from the beginning with, are we an empire or are we a democracy? And that's still playing out now. Those code points are being pushed by our politicians to divide us in cynical short-term benefit for themselves. So this is pertinent, as we know, very much today. So the answer that this dissertation sheds is an equitable economy is both a condition and a measure of a democratic society. They are directly related to each other. And I'll say it once again at the end, I'll revisit it, but I'm going to tell you some stories to ground this lesson for you. So an equitable economy is both a condition. If you're going to have democracy, you need an equitable economy, and a measure. If you live in a democracy, you should experience it in your daily life, and you should live it in your own values. This is another key point. So the question for us now is this a democracy? And if not, how are we going to improve it? So I'm going to present to you some narratives to help you understand those kind of highfalutin words I just gave you. So what is the counter-narrative we're given in the Valley? In particular, let's take water. Kings County, there's nowhere better to see the messaging around water and the counter-narrative. Congress created drought. Really? That's the exact opposite of what I would call democratic narrative. And then I'm going to give you some homework. If you want to see these, you have my dissertation, In the Struggle, Cornell, Daniel O'Connell, Google it, you can read it. Juxtapose the narratives that you'll find in that study to Google Devin Nunes's movie, Dead Harvest. It's on his website, Dead Harvest. And watch the narratives that are presented in Dead Harvest, which I would say is the counter-narrative to the democratic narrative. In particular in Dead Harvest, look at how poverty is framed. What is the narrative that Nunes gives you to explain why people are poor here? And look at the images, the most gut-wrenching images he uses in that video to evoke your sympathies. And yet, is it a true narrative of what he's saying? He's saying that water is being withheld, and that's causing the poverty. I would suggest the exact opposite has been. The implementation of federal law was not appropriately done 45 years ago, and that has resulted in a high degree of poverty here. So what is the democratic narrative? And to introduce it to you, I'm going to tell a story of the San Joaquin Valley. And it's a story of the dams that were built here. The dams in the San Joaquin Valley were built under a law passed in 1902 by a Republican president who was a progressive. That was Teddy Roosevelt. And that law was the 1902 Reclamation Law. That law enabled the Bureau of Reclamation to build dams all through the western United States. And progressives, after the Civil War, there was a tremendous consolidation of industry robber barons in the United States, and the counter-push resulted in the progressive movement at the turn of the last century. That movement was very much for promoting issues in the public interest. And one thing, if you're going to build dams in an arid region, all the value of the land that's currently held will rise. You'll go from grazing or dryland wheat to almonds and houses. So the value of the land the speculation will increase. And the progressives that were going to build the dams did not want the economic benefit to go to already wealthy people. And the land holdings in the San Joaquin Valley were already consolidated in large land holdings. So what did the law say? If you as a farmer or a rancher are going to sign a contract with the federal government to get water, you have to be a farm of 160 acres or less. And you have to live on the farm. This goes back to when I say agrarian democracy, it goes back to Jeffersonian democracy, or the revolutionary current in the creation of our country. And that law stipulated, it goes back to the Homestead Act in 1862. The whole Midwest was organized as 160-acre parcels under the Homestead Act. And the result of that was Kansas in 1902 was the most progressive state in the United States, with the Grange organizing ferociously. Today, Kansas is probably the most reactionary place in the United States because it's, I would argue, the economy of the Midwest in the 1980s consolidated during the farm crisis, and we've lost family farmers. So, let me just check time here for a moment. So, the federal government wanted to know, should they implement this law to mandate that farms of 160 acres or less should get the water and you need to live on the farm. And there was a beautiful other part of that law. If you signed the law and you had more than 160 acres, you needed to sell all land in excess of 160 acres at pre-water prices in 10 years. So, you signed the contract to get free water, we'll give you cheap water, we'll give you that water, but after 10 years you're selling all the excess land. The US government was going to enact a land reform. And don't think it's so radical because we did it to Japan after we beat them. Feudal Japan, we created democracy there by cutting up their land holdings. So if you voluntarily want water from the federal government, you were supposed to sell all the excess land, and this would have resulted in the San Joaquin Valley having many, many, many small farms. The federal government wanted to know, should we implement this law? And they conducted a study, a very simple study. And now, today, it's known as the Arvin and Dinuba study. So some of you are from the area between Dinuba and Arvin. Arvin is in Kern County. It was surrounded by Gregorio Farms, a major corporate landholder at the time. And Dinuba in Tulare County was surrounded mostly by small-scale farming. The result of that was published in a book, this book that I have here, which the author, Walter Goldschmidt, titled As You Sow, the prophetic biblical forewarning that if you don't build an equitable economy and you don't implement the law, which I think he saw that there was going to be problems in implementing the law, as you sow, so you shall reap. And I would argue that today, that insane poverty that we see, the incredible groundwater pollution, air pollution, probably some of the worst in the United States, both here, and the hunger, the people who pick our crops are hungry. So we should be offended that this is a status quo that we don't organize around more, and your vote right now will be part of that. So let me just read from you from the findings, just to ground it a little bit. Economically, what happened when the comparison between Arvin and Dinuba happened? And I'll just read a few. I've tried to do this before and it gets clunky, but this is Walter Goldschmidt writing his summary of findings. Certain conclusions are particularly significant to the small businessman. He's writing to the small businessman. And to an understanding of the importance of his place in the community. Not only does the small farm itself constitute a small business, but it supports a flourishing small business community. Again, I can reframe this. You need a middle class if you're going to have a democracy. That's probably a better way to say it for a politician. You need a middle class if you're going to have a democracy. What were some of the findings from Arvin and Dinuba? Analysis of the business conditions in the communities of Arvin and Dinuba show that 1, the small farm community supported 62 separate business establishments, but only 35 in the large farm community, a ratio factor of the small farm community of nearly 2 to 1. The farmers were buying food and buying supplies in Dinuba. Money in a market economy is like blood in your body. You want it circulating. You don't want a major artery cut and the blood spurting out outside of your body. You want all the blood circulating in your body. That's local economics. 2, the volume of retail sale in small farm community during a 12-month period of analysis was 4,500,000 against only 2,500,000 in a large farm community. Retail trade in Dinuba was greater by 61%. The expenditure for household supplies and building equipment was over 3 times as great in the small farm community as it was in the large farm community. Isn't the infrastructure that's allowed to atrophy in downtown Hanford tell you what once happened here when there were small farms? And in the rural communities like Stratford, where there is no existing businesses, isn't that the result of physical representation of the narrative that I give you? But this goes beyond just economics. It goes also to the civic life of these communities. Because if you're going to have a PTA, if you're going to have all the civic life of Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, you also similarly need a middle class. Over half of the breadwinners in the small farm community were independently employed business people, persons in white-collar employment, or farmers in the large farm community, or farmers. In the large farm community, the proportion was less than 1/5 of business owners. Next, less than 1/3 of the breadwinners in the small farm community were farm workers. He calls them agricultural wage laborers, characteristically landless and with low income and insecure income, while the proportion of persons in this position reaches an astonishing figure of nearly 2/3 of all persons gainfully employed in a large farm community were farm workers. You think of Mendota or Huron. What is the percentage today? And we're not even talking about people that many of those can no longer vote, right? So on and on, twice the number of schools, many more newspapers in Dinuba than Arvin. And, very important, Arvin was not incorporated at the time. So the county was responsible for all the services where Dinuba was incorporated. There was 4 schools and a high school in Dinuba and 1 elementary school in Arvin at that time. There was 3 parks in Dinuba. There was 1 corporate-owned parcel that was allowed to be used by the community in Arvin. So you see that if you don't have a middle class, an equitable economy, your civic life and your ability to both invigorate and defend democracy itself craters. So we'll move forward now from the Arvin-Dinuba study, and I'll finish up with what I'm calling the democratic narrative. The findings, what happened, these findings were clear. Dinuba was better than Arvin in 1944. What did the US government do with that? And as a student at UC Davis, somebody literally gave me this book. I looked at it, and I was like, whoa, this is something. Why wasn't that law implemented? The study was censored immediately. And a case study between 2 towns is academically not very rigorous. There could be other reasons why Dinuba was better than Arvin. So they were going to do a regression statistical analysis of all communities in the San Joaquin Valley. That further research was suppressed. For how long? 30 years. The next study was only done when Jerry Brown, in his first administration, came in and allowed the research to be done at UC Davis, finally after 30 years. So don't think that the pollution that happens when you have undemocratic structures stays within the valley. It affects the entire infrastructure of public universities and the federal government. Because I mentioned to you, all the farmers signed the contracts and got the water. Was the law implemented? No. Federal law was never implemented. Even after, in 1959, a 9-0 Supreme Court decision said you have to implement the law. 9-0. 1959. And there was enough worry in 1959 that they would implement, that the state of California built the State Water Project, which is a big giveaway to farmers in Kern, right? Still, only in 1979, another Supreme Court decision. So if you don't control, a lesson here is if you don't control the sheriff, you don't implement the law. The US government's not going to send the army in here to do land reform, right? So this gets worse and worse and worse. By 1978, the federal law is overturned, and we have a system where the new law said you have to have farms of 960 acres and you didn't have to live on the farm. I'm beginning in just a few more minutes, so I'm going to go quick here. There was other subsidies. So let me ask you another question. What is the role of government in a market economy? We have a market economy and we have a democracy. What's the role of government there? So, for instance, Public Law 78 created the Braceros program. 20 years, imported labor from Mexico, federally subsidized. And after Braceros, there was an encouraging of undocumented labor that filled and changed the cultural dynamic and demographics that we're realizing today. And those children of those farm workers are now tough, smart people who witnessed their parents being abused, and they're ready to vote. And they're going to need you. They're going to need you to help them. And I know how wise you all are, but we, especially white people, especially white men, have to be humble and listen and support women of color, young women of color, made significantly in the environmental justice movement to change this situation. So I'll conclude with the current context and some strategies that I will suggest for you. First of all, we made significant gains. We, people of color, especially African American and Latinos, made huge gains in the civil rights movement. Immediately after that, the Southern strategy was implemented. You saw the Democratic Party move away from segregation and the Republicans start moving towards it. And those chickens are coming home to roost for the Republican Party now. Read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Right now, many, many prisons are in the San Joaquin Valley, and those prisons are a means that I would argue that we took the vote away from people of color the moment they got the right to vote. And we need to advocate for them to get the vote back. Second of all, from the beginning of our revolution, taxation without representation was a foundation. Farm workers pay taxes. They just can't vote, and that's killing us. We have to advocate for the most vulnerable people, and they are the most exposed because they can't vote, they don't know the language. We have to advocate with and for them and get them to vote. The final one is the structure of our institutions now. California water districts, like the Westlands Water District, that's a special district. It is a government entity. Do you know how voting is apportioned in the Westlands Water District? By how many acres you have is how many votes you have. Not one person, one vote. So the Westlands Water District is one of the biggest government entities in our region, and yet it's completely structured as undemocratic. So I'll say that in the history of what we have now, in answer to the question, what's the role of government in a market economy, what do we have here? We have socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor. The exact opposite of what the role of government should be, which is regulate the corruption that naturally occurs within market economies and to fill the gap in services. A 5-year-old immigrant girl can't pay for her education. We're going to pay for that. And then there's other debates on affordable housing and healthcare and retirement that they will try to take from us if we're not defending them. So I will end with that and just say thank you. If you'd like to see the research, it's there for you. There's so many beloved people I work with already here, and I just want to say thank you. Oh, the final thing, we're going to win here in the Valley. The question is